Welcome to Chapter 3. This is where we roll up our sleeves and get into the concepts you'll use every single day as a privacy professional. And it all starts with one deceptively simple question: what is personal data? Here's what we'll unpack together. First, the official definition under Article 4 and why regulators interpret it so broadly. Then we'll explore identifiability, the difference between direct identifiers like your name and indirect identifiers like your postcode and birth date, which can unmask you when combined. Next, we'll meet the VIP section of personal data, the special categories: health, religion, biometrics, and other sensitive information that gets bodyguard level protection, including a default prohibition on processing with only limited exceptions. Finally, we'll tackle two terms that professionals confuse constantly: pseudonymization and anonymization. One keeps you inside the GDPR with reduced risk, the other takes you outside the GDPR entirely, and knowing the difference can save your organization from serious mistakes. Why does this chapter matter so much? Because every GDPR obligation switches on only when personal data is involved. Get the definition wrong, and everything downstream goes wrong with it. Let's get this foundation rock solid. Let's start with the official definition and then, as always, break it down into plain words. Article 4 says personal data means any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. Short sentence, enormous reach. Notice the word any. Not just sensitive information, not just private information, any information. Your name, obviously, but also your email address, your IP address, your location trail, your customer ID, the cookies tracking your browsing, even an opinion your manager wrote about you in a performance review. If it relates to you and you can be identified, it's personal data. Here's something that surprises many of my students. Even inaccurate information is personal data. If a credit agency wrongly records that you missed payments, that false record still relates to you and is fully protected. In fact, you have the right to correct it. Two boundaries to remember. The person must be natural, meaning a human being, so data about companies as such isn't covered. And the person must be living. Deceased individuals fall outside the GDPR, though member states can add their own rules there. When I run data mapping workshops, teams always underestimate what qualifies. They count the customer database but forget call recordings, badge access logs, and support chat transcripts. So here's your professional habit from day one. When in doubt, treat it as personal data. Regulators and courts consistently read this definition broadly, and so should you. So we know personal data relates to an identifiable person. But what makes someone identifiable? This is where it gets interesting and where organizations most often fool themselves. Direct identifiers are the obvious ones: a name, a passport number, an employee ID. One piece of information, one person, done. But indirect identifiers are the sneaky ones. Your birth date alone doesn't identify you. Thousands share it. Your postcode alone doesn't either. But combine birth date, postcode, and gender? Research famously showed that combination can uniquely identify the vast majority of a population. Individually innocent, collectively revealing. The legal test comes from Recital 26. Ask whether identification is possible using all means reasonably likely to be used, considering the cost, time, and technology available. And technology keeps advancing, so what's unidentifiable today might not stay that way. Here's the concept that really matters: singling out. You don't need someone's name to affect them. Imagine an advertising platform that knows device IDX visits fitness sites at 6 a.m. and orders takeaway on Fridays. The platform can target, profile, and influence that person without ever knowing their name. That's still identification in the GDPR's eyes. I once reviewed a dataset a client called Anonymous. It had no names, but it contained precise job titles and office locations. The chief financial officer of a named branch identified in seconds. Let that be your cautionary tale. Removing names is not anonymization. More on that soon. Now let's meet the data that gets VIP protection. Article 9 lists what we call special categories of personal data, and I want you to memorize this list because the exam will test it. Here it is. Data revealing racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, and trade union membership. Then genetic data, biometric data when used to uniquely identify someone, health data, and data concerning a person's sex life or sexual orientation. Why these? Ask yourself what they have in common. Each one, if misused, can fuel discrimination, exclusion, or persecution. Think back to our history chapter where registers of religion enabled atrocities. Health data can cost someone insurance or a job. Political opinions can invite retaliation. The stakes are simply higher, so the protection is stronger. Watch out for a subtle word in the text, revealing. Data doesn't have to state the sensitive fact directly. If a grocery loyalty program shows someone buys only halal products, that purchasing pattern may reveal religious belief. If a fitness app logs visits to an oncology clinic, that location data may reveal health information. Inferences count. One more distinction the exam loves. Criminal conviction and offense data is not in Article 9. It lives separately in Article 10 with its own safeguards, generally requiring official authority or specific legal authorization. Keep those two boxes separate in your mind. Next, let's see what the law actually says you can and cannot do with special category data. Here's where the GDPR does something dramatic. For special category data, it doesn't start with rules for processing. It starts with a ban. Article 9, paragraph 1 says processing of these categories shall be prohibited, full stop. But of course, life requires exceptions. Hospitals must process health data. Employers must handle disability accommodations. Churches must keep member lists. So paragraph 2 provides a limited set of gateways, and I'll walk you through the main ones. The most familiar is explicit consent. A clear, affirmative, specific statement, stronger than regular consent. Then come exceptions for employment and social security law, protecting vital interests when someone can't consent. Imagine an unconscious patient in an emergency room. And processing by non-profit bodies like unions or religious organizations for their own members. There's also an exception when the data subject has manifestly made the data public themselves. Plus gateways for legal claims, substantial public interest, healthcare and occupational medicine, public health, and research with safeguards. Now here's the compliance point people miss, and I've seen it trip up experienced teams. You need 2 legal justifications, not one. An Article 6 lawful basis, which we'll cover in Chapter 9, and an Article 9 exception on top. Think of it as needing both a ticket and a boarding pass. When a client's HR team processed employee health data with only legitimate interests as their justification, that was half a boarding pass, and it wouldn't survive regulatory scrutiny. Let's now talk about a word that's hard to pronounce but easy to understand once you see it in action: pseudonymization. The GDPR defines it as processing personal data so it can no longer be attributed to a specific person without the use of additional information, where that additional information is kept separately and protected. Let's translate. You replace the identifying details with a code and you lock the codebook in a different drawer. Imagine a clinical trial. Researchers see patient 472, her age, and her test results, but not her name. The master list linking patient 472 to an actual person sits with a separate custodian under strict access controls. The researchers work freely, and if the dataset leaks, the thief gets codes, not identities. That's pseudonymization doing its job. Common techniques include tokenization, where values are swapped for random tokens, hashing with a secret key, encryption, and simple reference numbers with a protected lookup table. The critical requirement in every case is separation. If the key sits in the same spreadsheet, one tab away, you've built a lock and taped the key to it. Now, the single most important sentence of this slide and a guaranteed exam concept. Pseudonymized data is still personal data. Re-identification remains possible with the key, so the GDPR continues to apply in full. Pseudonymization reduces risk, it never removes regulation. Keep that firmly in mind as we look at why it's still absolutely worth doing. So if pseudonymized data is still regulated, why bother? Great question. Let me show you why regulators and I keep recommending it. First, breach damage control. Picture two companies suffering identical laptop thefts. Company A's laptop held raw customer records, names, emails, purchase histories. Company B's held pseudonymized records with the key safely on a separate server. Company A faces panicked customers and likely must notify everyone. Company B can credibly argue the risk to individuals is low, potentially avoiding notification to data subjects altogether. Same incident, dramatically different outcomes. Second, the GDPR explicitly rewards it. Article 25 names pseudonymization as a data protection by design measure. Article 32 lists it as a security measure. When regulators assess whether you took appropriate precautions, pseudonymization sits on the positive side of the ledger. It also supports compatibility when you want to use data for new analytical purposes, and it's a recognized safeguard for scientific research. Third, it enables business value safely. Your analytics team rarely needs to know who customer 881 is, only what customers like 881 do. Pseudonymization lets insight flow while identity stays locked down. When I helped a retail client pseudonymize their analytics pipeline, the project paid for itself the day an access misconfiguration exposed a dataset. Because what leaked was codes, not people. Reduced risk, reduced panic, reduced liability. That's the return on investment. But what if you want to leave the GDPR entirely? That requires something stronger. Now for the strongest medicine in the cabinet, anonymization. Get this right, and the data leaves the GDPR entirely. Get it wrong, and you're processing personal data while telling yourself you aren't, which is exactly how enforcement stories begin. Anonymization means irreversibly preventing identification, taking into account all means reasonably likely to be used by anyone. The keyword is irreversible. No key exists, no combination of effort and technology can realistically bring the individuals back. Recital 26 confirms that truly anonymous data falls outside data protection law altogether. How do you achieve it? Techniques include aggregation, reporting only group-level statistics like 40% of customers are aged 30 to 40, generalization, replacing exact ages with age bands, exact locations with regions, noise addition, deliberately perturbing values so individual records become unreliable, and more formal models like k-anonymity, ensuring every record is indistinguishable from at least several others, or differential privacy, which adds mathematically calibrated noise. But here's the test that matters. Robust anonymization must resist three attacks: singling out an individual, linking records across datasets, and inferring new facts about someone. Remember my client whose so-called anonymous file still contained job titles and office locations? It failed the singling out test instantly. So treat anonymization as an engineering discipline with a legal consequence, not a checkbox, and retest it over time because the reasonably likely means of identification grow every year. Let's bring this chapter home by putting our two techniques side by side, because distinguishing them is both an exam favorite and a daily professional skill. Think of it this way. Pseudonymization is wearing a mask. Anonymization is plastic surgery with no medical records. The mask can come off. Someone holds the key. So the person underneath is still legally present, and the GDPR still applies in full. Surgery with no way back means the original identity is gone and data protection law lets go. From that single difference, everything else flows. Pseudonymized data remains personal data, so you still need a legal basis, still honor data subject rights, still notify breaches where required. Anonymous data carries none of those obligations. Pseudonymization is a safeguard you apply while continuing to use personal data. Anonymization is an exit you take when identity is no longer needed at all. Here's how the exam typically frames it. A scenario describes a company that replaced names with codes and stored the key on a secure internal server, then claims GDPR no longer applies. Your alarm should ring immediately. A key exists, reversal is possible, that's pseudonymization, and the claim is wrong. And one habit for real life. Whenever someone says the word anonymized in a meeting, ask politely, can anyone, anywhere, reverse this? You'd be amazed how often the honest answer is, well, technically yes. Now you know exactly what follows from that answer. Great work today. Let's close the chapter. And that's chapter 3 complete. Take a moment to appreciate what you can now do. You can look at any piece of information and judge whether it's personal data, whether it's special category, and whether a so-called anonymized dataset would actually survive scrutiny. Those are skills many working professionals still get wrong. Before you continue, 3 quick things. First, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. It gives you the full run of this playlist and every other certification playlist we've built, from privacy to AI governance to cybersecurity. One click and your study library grows substantially. Second, keep following the playlist in order. Next up are the processing principles and the roles of controllers and processors, and I promise the concepts from today, especially special categories, will reappear immediately. The sequence is the strategy. Third, if you're serious about passing on your first attempt, have a look at our complete CIPP/E course on Udemy. You'll get these lessons in a structured format, plus chapter quizzes, realistic practice tests, role-play scenarios, and downloadable resources you can revise offline. Many students tell me the practice tests were the difference on exam day. The link is waiting in the description. Alright, stretch your legs, refill that coffee, and meet me in chapter 4, where we learn the 7 golden principles that every GDPR obligation flows from. See you there.